The 20th of July 1969. The lunar module of the Apollo 11 mission landed on the moon. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were in it after the landing. Neil Armstrong opened the door and gets down on the moon. Within his heavy spacesuit, Neil Armstrong got out and stepped on the moon's surface. He became the first man to step on the moon.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Did it actually happen? Totally more than 50 years later. Many people refuse to believe that humans had gone to the moon. People cook up theories of their own to claim that the entire Apollo 11 mission was a farce put up by America. What's the truth to it? Come, let's try to understand this story in today's video.
3, 2, 1, 0, all engine running.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Houston, we see you on a stereo, over. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man.
Friends, you'd be surprised to know the real reason why Apollo 11 mission was planned was a Cold War. It was fought between America and the Soviet Union. Both countries were engaged in a space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union became the first country to launch the first artificial satellite. It was named Sputnik, and it was the first man-made object to be placed in Earth's orbit. The American government was shocked to see the Soviets getting ahead. Months later, in 1958, America launched their satellite as well, but 3 years later, in 1961, America got another shock. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was the first person to go to space. Soviets beat America once again. 1 week later, the then President of America, John F. Kennedy, wrote a letter to the Vice President dated the 20th of April, 1961. He asked the Vice President how they could beat the Soviet Union by putting a laboratory in space or by a trip around the moon. Are we working 24 hours a day on existing programs? If not, why not? Are we making the maximum effort, asking if there was another space program that could be achieved quickly, that would produce dramatic results and give them a lead in the race? He got the answer some days later, because he soon realized that next big step would be to send humans to the moon. On the 25th of May 1961, in his famous speech, he promised the world that he would send humans to the moon before the end of the decade. Not only this, he also promised to get the humans back on Earth safely.
This decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
This was an unbelievable announcement. He was promising to send humans to the moon for this. Over the next 5 years, he provided $9 billion in additional funding to the space program. The entire space agency was engaged in fulfilling this one aim. Mere months later, the tests began. First, they tested the rockets that would be used to leave the Earth. Then the heat shields of the command modules were tested, how much they'd be able to resist heat. Then the propulsion system of the service module. Between 1963 to 1967, many unmanned tests were carried out. The rockets didn't carry any humans during the tests. In February 1967, the first manned tests, a test in which astronauts will go up to space in the rockets. This was the Apollo 1 mission. But during the tests on Earth, on the 27th of January 1967, the cabin caught on fire, and the 3 astronauts preparing to go to space died in the fire. After this painful event, NASA didn't lose courage. Instead, it continued further testing. Apollo 4, Apollo 5, and Apollo 6 were all unmanned missions for further testing. In October 1968, Apollo 7 mission was launched, and once again they attempted to send humans to space. This was successful only 2 months later. In December 1968, Apollo 8 mission was launched, in which 3 astronauts were sent near the moon. 3 months later, in March 1969, Apollo 9 mission was launched. In this, The lunar module was tested, the part of the spacecraft that was actually going to land on the moon, and 2 months after that. In May 1969 was the Apollo 10 mission. In this mission, 3 astronauts had to do almost everything for practice that was supposed to be done in Apollo 11 mission, except actually landing on the moon. On the 16th of July 1969, Apollo 11 mission was launched.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
3 astronauts were a part of this mission. 38-year-old Commander Neil Armstrong. He led this mission, the pilot of the command module. Michael Collins, and the pilot of the lunar module. Edwin Buzz Aldrin. These 3 names are inscribed in the pages of history. The spacecraft of this Apollo 11 mission had 3 main parts: the command module, service module, and the lunar module. The first 2 are collectively known as CSM, Command and Service Module. They aim to detach the lunar module and have it land on the moon, and to return, the lunar module would have to barrel-launched and attached to the CSM to enable the astronauts to return to Earth to launch this spacecraft. A Saturn V rocket was to be used before the launch. The rocket was loaded with 1 million gallon of kerosene, liquid oxygen, and liquid hydrogen. The weight of this rocket was 3 million kg. With its help, the spacecraft reached Earth's orbit. It took less than 10 minutes to reach the orbit. Then they made about 1.5 revolutions around the Earth, after which they were given the permission from the mission control. The mission control was, of course, based on Earth. They communicated their permission to begin translunar injection, i.e., taking the spacecraft out of Earth's orbit and towards Moon's orbit. To leave Earth's orbit, the Saturn V rocket was used. This was the 3rd stage for the rocket. These events took place within 5 hours of the launch, but to actually reach the moon took several days. Astronauts waited in the spacecraft, ate, slept, and took pictures of themselves and their surroundings. The 19th of July 1969. After traveling for almost 400,000 kilometers, the Apollo 11 spacecraft reached Moon's orbit. Here, it was supposed to be split into 2: the command and service module, separated from the lunar module. Michael Collins was in the command module. This part of the spacecraft was nicknamed Columbia, and the lunar module was nicknamed the Eagle. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were in it. The thing is that the command and service module was tasked to remain in the moon's orbit. Only the lunar module was going to land on the moon. It meant that only Armstrong and Aldrin had the chance to step on the moon, and not Michael Collins. Perhaps this is the reason why not many people know Michael Collins. Even though he was a part of the Apollo mission, he did not step on the moon. But even so, Michael Collins' part in this mission was perhaps the most important, because the lunar module was supposed to be reattached to the CSM. Without Michael Collins, Armstrong and Aldrin could not have returned safely. Around 8 p.m., the lunar module was going to land on the moon. Exactly at 8:10 p.m., alarms went off. 12:01 and 12:02 alarms.
12:01. 12:01. Roger. 12:01 alarm. 12:02.
Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knew the meaning of this alarm. They asked the mission control what they ought to do next. Mission control tells them to ignore it and keep going. We're go. Same time. We're go. Later, they figured out that 12:02 was a warning. The processing system of the guidance computer of the Apollo was overloaded. But thankfully, the computer was designed in a way that essential programs, which were critical for the mission, would continue despite being overloaded. The computer was installed with the program for automatic landing. This would automatically land the lunar module on Moon's surface, but at the height of 150 meters, Neil Armstrong took over the control. He noticed that the lunar module was going to land at a place where huge boulders were strewn about. The landing spot was changed then, and they decided on another spot for miles from the predetermined landing spot for the actual landing. At 8:16 p.m., Buzz Aldrin checked the fuel indicator. Only 5% fuel remained.
3.5 down, 9 forward. 5%. How many pipes?
The low level of fuel, the mission control initiated a countdown. The countdown to decide whether they should land or abort the mission. Now
Fuel state, and that's why the 60-second call was given, and then the 30-second call.
Literally at the last minute, with only 30 seconds remaining in this countdown, Neil Armstrong sent a radio message to Earth. Roger, tranquility. The Eagle had successfully landed.
Clear. Roger. And we're getting a picture on the TV. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
Neil Armstrong put on his spacesuit, opened the door, and stepped on the moon. This moment was watched by 650 million people on television. His first words were televised to the world as Aldrin followed him on the moon's surface. And for the next 2.5 hours, they collected samples of the moon's dust and rocks, took photographs, set up several scientific instruments as well. Although it is true that the Cold War was a big reason for this moon landing, but because the moon landing was already planned, it was such a huge achievement, so obviously they were carrying scientific instruments with them. There were several scientific objectives of this mission as well. They set up a television camera on the moon to transmit signals to the Earth. They took a device with them to measure the solar winds reaching the moon. They installed a device to send laser beams to the Earth so that the laser beams could be used to compute the exact distance between Earth and Moon. They also had a passive seismometer to measure the earthquakes on the moon.
Wouldn't have these giant pieces of it, but as
They collected 23 kilograms of rock and dust from the moon, and they left behind an American flag and a plate with the inscription here. Men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. If you want to know, the lunar module had to remain on the moon for 21 hours. After this, it had to take off once again and attach to the CSM engine. Finally, the lunar module was reattached to the CSM, and the 3 astronauts turned the spacecraft towards Earth. The plan for landing on Earth was that the command module and the service module would be separated. The service module would then be destroyed due to Earth's atmosphere. But there was a danger that if the service module was damaged severely, with its debris floating all around, they may hit the command module, killing the astronauts on board. To avoid this, NASA installed thrusters in the service module to take it far from the command module, so that they do not collide with each other. But when the astronauts were returning to Earth, they found out that the thrusters on the service module weren't working. The 3 astronauts could only sit in the command module and watch the service module break apart around them. Its debris was floating all around them. The command module safely descended the Earth's atmosphere. The parachutes were deployed, and it landed in the ocean. All 3 astronauts were alive and safe. These astronauts were then evacuated by rescue ships from the ocean. It was truly a miracle that they could return alive. It wasn't that the mission had gone exactly as it was planned. They had to face problems at almost every step. They successfully dealt with the problems, and they could return alive. It is interesting to note that after returning, the 3 astronauts were quarantined for 2 weeks. They weren't allowed to be in contact with other humans because of the risk of them carrying pathogens, viruses, or bacteria that they might have encountered on Moon that could possibly wreak havoc on Earth. No one knew for sure, but again, thankfully, nothing of the sort happened. Apollo 11 moon landing was the top news in newspapers worldwide. The US President Kennedy's promise of having humans land on the moon before the end of the decade was made possible by NASA in 1969.
In 1969, the public had little reason to question mankind's historic first step on the moon. After all, the achievement was a celebration of technological supremacy. America had finally won the space race.
America did what their president had pledged in 1961. But John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 and did not live to see the day. The place from where Apollo was being launched was named in his honor. That place was named Cape Kennedy. Today, the place from most of NASA's important missions are launched is the Kennedy Space Center. In 1969, America had gone far ahead of Russia in the space race. After the moon landing, public enthusiasm about Apollo began to wane. That's all for today. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.